It's not very often NFL fans get a peek behind the curtain of their NFL team's draft plans, but the Jets kind of get that this year. I'm Glenn Norton with JetNation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We are going to take a look. I went back. I mentioned this the other day when Dylan Turman and I did our Thursday night show. I said I started going back. The Jets, of course, hired Rick Spielman, top advisor to Darren Mougey, GM. Spielman, many years of experience as an executive, as a GM, worked with the Dolphins, worked with the Vikings. And I'm a big fan of his show. Him and Ryan Wilson with the first pick through CBS Sports. I've been an avid listener for a couple of years. So I was more than happy. Bit time consuming, but I was more than happy to go back and listen to, I went back to sort of late November. So every November, every December, every January, all the shows they've done over the past few months to take notes. Now, I had general ideas on how Spielman felt about a lot of these guys because I'm a regular listener. But I thought, if I'm going to share his thoughts with everyone else, let's go back and get them, make sure we're accurate and kind of jot down notes on guys who we may have forgotten or we may have missed. So I've got an extensive list. Some of it may be a little bit repetitive because they touch on multiple players multiple times. And I just went chronologically. I just listened to, 10, 11, 12 shows. More than that. And just took notes on what he thought about these guys. And some of the stuff is some of it's surprising, some of it not so surprising. I've seen some talk about how he talked about Jaxson Dart coming out of Ole Miss, and it seems some people were going off of some of the older podcasts from a few weeks ago because Spielman did change his opinion of Dart from just a few weeks ago to Mobile, and he talked about being in Mobile. I talked about how Spielman said day one of practice in Mobile, one of the biggest things to him was Jaxson Dart throwing the football. He said he thought he threw the ball much better in person than he thought he did on film, which kind of emphasizes, this ongoing debate I had with all these Jets fans who don't feel like it's important to go watch a player in person. And I just disagreed with that. And Spielman kind of reinforces that with some of his takes on these guys, as he'll mention, when he gets to the small school guys at one point, he's like, this is the reason you come to Mobile. Like, you come here to watch these smaller school guys perform against the bigger school guys. Because it's the first opportunity you get to watch these guys against upper echelon competition, minus maybe one or two games during their college careers. This is 3 days of practice, every single rep against the guy who's a draft. They're not locks, but draft likely, guys likely to be picked. So we'll go back. I started at late November, like I said, and I'm going to go through. I'm not going to read every single note because some of it does get repetitive, but I took a couple hundred notes, as I said. First things first, though. If there's anything you need to know about Rick Spielman, here's a few things that to start your Rick Spielman knowledge. Loves pickleball, loves a good Hallmark movie, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. I remember them giving him a hard time over that a couple of years ago when I started listening. Big fan of Harry Mack, the freestyle street rapper. If you're not familiar with his work, I recommend him. Very good. Apparently last year during the Combine, while they were interviewing players, between interviews, Spielman could be found lying on the sofa listening to Harry Mack on YouTube or watching Harry Mack videos on YouTube. Loves a good squeeze ball for all of his anxiety when people aggravate him with some of their dumb takes. He says he's got about 20 of them. He always takes one on the road with him. So when people say stupid things, he doesn't lash out. Good job by Spielman there. And don't be a flip-flopper. He often liked to test his scouts. He would often do this with his co-host Ryan Wilson. He would take a position he did not believe just to see what the response would be. For example, if a player says, "Oh, I really love Cam Ward," Spielman might say to that scout, "He's no good. He can't do this. He can't do that." Does the scout back down? Or does the scout say, "What are you talking about, Rick? This guy can do these things you say he can't do." And he's testing your mettle. He's testing how confident you are in your evaluations. So Spielman, big on testing his scouts. Of course, these won't be his scouts. They'll be Darren Mougey scouts with the Jets. But I'm sure there will be some interaction and some conversations during player evaluation. So one thing they did enjoy doing was doing a weekly breakdown of their top 5 quarterbacks in the country. You'll notice that they go from, early on, there are some names on here of guys who ended up not coming out, so we won't go too deep into that. And there are days where he'll just mention a player and not go really in depth. He'll say, "Shooter is my number 2 still." And just there's nothing else that needs to be said. So again, going back to late November, quarterback evaluations. And there is a Jaxson Dart comment here, even though Dart isn't in his top 5. They normally did the top 5, but would occasionally drop down to 6 or 7 and mention a couple of other guys. So Cam Ward, who, as you know, from if you're a fan of Jet Nation Radio, you know that we're huge fans of the show, or you know that we're huge fans of Cam Ward on the show. And he said Cam Ward was very impressed with his resiliency, the fact that he came from a smaller school, going to Incarnate Word, then moving on to Washington State. Then it looked like he was going to enter the draft, and he felt at that point, from what he'd seen of Cam Ward, that Cam Ward was a day 3 pick. I would have even disagreed with that. What the hell do I know? I thought he was a day 1, or sorry, a top 50 pick. He ends up going back to school and plays some great football and plays himself into position to be a likely top 2 pick. So Spielman did like the resiliency. He mentions that a few times about different players. He's a big fan of guys betting on themselves, which Cam Ward obviously did going back to school when it looked like he was going to come out. Reposition the mic here. He had Shador as his number 2. He had Beck out of Georgia as his 3. He obviously went back to school. Jalen Milroe was his 4. And this is a theme you'll see with him when he talks about Milroe. He gets, again, they evaluate these guys throughout the year. Not a lot changes, so they do end up repeating themselves sometimes. But he basically says about Milroe, best dual threat quarterback in the class, has Lamar Jackson traits as a runner. He can make all the throws, but the accuracy is inconsistent. This is something we've talked about on our show. You don't have to be a former GM to watch Milroe and see that he struggles with some of the intermediate underneath stuff. Spielman mentions this many times throughout the season. And he basically says, if you're going to draft Milroe, you're getting a good player, but you're going to have to draft your offense around him. You can't draft him and try to squeeze him into a West Coast offense. Don't ask him to be a West Coast guy. Don't ask him to drop back and make 3 or 4 reads because you're going to set him up to fail. Put him in an offense where you're going to let him use his legs to make plays. And he throws a great deep ball. This is, again, you don't have to be a former GM to observe this. I've said it many times. If you only watch Jalen Milroe run and throw deep balls, you'd think, wow, what's this guy, something else. But then with the turnovers, which Spielman doesn't mention that really, but that was something that jumped out at me. I remember mentioning on our show that I had messaged Dylan Terman and Chris Schubert a couple months ago and said, all this Milroe talk, and I see a lot of turnovers for a guy who's, people telling me he's going to go in the first round. So those are his notes on Milroe early on. With Quinn Ewers, and he mentions this a couple times throughout the process, concerns about his durability and his pocket awareness. And he was a little concerned that he didn't see Ewers push the ball down the field quite as much once Xavier Worthy left. And I've just jotted down a couple of notes that he shares here. And one thing was, to me, this is fairly obvious. I know I've had some disagreements with some folks in recent weeks about how you prioritize evaluating these guys. How much do you weigh an interview versus a practice and things like that. And Spielman just says, trust your eyes in your evaluations. Don't move guys up and down a bunch. Now, he doesn't say not at all. Yeah, fine. If a guy blows you away in an interview, maybe you move him up a few spots. But you don't go rebuilding your board based on interviews. So he basically says, trust your eyes in evaluation. Don't move guys up a bunch because you like them in an interview. Then he did touch on, he did mention Jaxson Dart, who at that point was his 7th ranked quarterback. At that point in time, he was saying average arm talent. He did like the throws down the field. He wasn't playing in an NFL offense, which I've said in the past is my number one concern, the way Lane Kiffin schemes people open, and it's a one-read system. But he did say Dart is a better athlete than he expected, and but that he did notice he doesn't have that, or he felt he didn't have that natural arm talent where he could just fling it, where he had to get his body behind the ball to get it downfield. But he did have deep ball accuracy, which many folks have observed before about him. We've talked about it on our show. Then he went on. This is now moving on to the following week's episode. And some of these, they do have shows where they talk more about pro than college. They'll recap the week's event, so there may not be a ton of thoughts on draft prospects some weeks, compared to others. This was an interesting one because I've often wondered about this. Right? We've seen as Jets fans, we've seen a lot of kickers come and go over the years. A lot of teams have, and you wonder, how do you keep missing on a kicker? But then I've thought to myself, like, how do you scout a kicker? I mean, really, truly, and honestly, how do you do that? To me, it's if the guy can boom the ball through the uprights from 50 plus consistently, okay, good. That's good kicker. So what he's saying, what Spielman says here about kickers, front offices and general managers know very little about kickers, and it usually comes down to who the special teams coach recommends. And he's speaking from his experience, from talking to other GMs. And he says, and this is, we hear all the time about how fragile kickers can be and how it's so much of the playing the position is psychology. And that's what Spielman says. It's more mental than physical being a kicker. There were times with the Vikings where he hated Tuesdays because Tuesday was kicker tryout day. And every Tuesday, 5 more guys, 5 more guys, 5 more guys. And, special teams coach would be there and you got to defer to him. Are any of these guys better than what we've got? And he kind of half jokingly said, if I was able to figure out kickers, I wouldn't be doing a podcast. So he had some issues in Minnesota at times with kickers. He also mentioned, again, some of these notes are random, not so much player related, but just little nuggets that he threw out there during the shows. And this was interesting because, he's obviously taking part in the search for a Jets head coach. And there were those of us who said it's got to be an offensive guy. Me personally, and what Spielman says here is something I've said many times over the years, but I was all out on it this year. This year, I was like, get an offensive guy. I want the man at the head of the table to have experience in building and developing a quarterback. Because we got it. How long does this rut have to go on of not being able to develop a quarterback? But Spielman says here, when you're looking for a head coach, that you just got to find great leaders who can connect with their players. And I don't think anybody would argue that the Jets got that with Aaron Glenn. You look at the way his players responded to him with the Lions. You hear, some of the things he says about going to players' houses and sitting and watching film with them for hours, or having players come to him and whatever it may be. So Aaron Glenn, obviously a guy who can connect. And it makes you wonder how the hell a guy like Adam Gase gets a job. Well, he hasn't since the Jets. Later on, again, they did the next rendition of the quarterback rankings. There were no changes to his top 5. He did say that now this is interesting because this will change later on. Well, not change, but come into question later on. Speaking about Cam Ward, Rick Spielman says he's got high football character. On one play, he saw when Miami turned it over, Cam Ward chases the guy down, the defender chases him down 50 yards to make the tackle. And he's like, there you go. That's a football player. That's what you look for. That's high character. That shows a lot about the person he is, not just the player. Then on Milroe, again, he had no extensive thoughts on Shedeur, just had him as his number 2 still. With Milroe, still says he can't throw it as well as Lamar Jackson does, so teams will view him differently. Asked to compare Milroe to Justin Fields, who is another great runner. He felt Justin Fields had a more smooth delivery, a better delivery throwing the football than Milroe did. But again, he mentioned he touches again on there on loving guys who are willing to compete and bet on themselves. They broke down some tackles. They went over some tackles, and this is important for the Jets because the Jets, obviously, this is a position they'll be looking to fill. Connor Hughes reporting apparently that Morgan Moses, right tackle, is not expected back. Listen, bringing him back would have been the smart move. But, this could be Morgan Moses saying, I'm old now, and I'm tired of being on a bad football team. And I don't know how far away you guys are from being any good. We don't have a quarterback right now. So I can't blame Moses, whether it was the Jets call saying we don't want you anymore, or whether it was Morgan Moses saying I don't want to come back. I can't blame Moses if he doesn't want to be with his team. He's an older guy, and he's been on good teams, he's been on bad teams, and guess what? I bet it's a lot more fun being on a good team. Anyway, breaking down some of the tackles they went into, Josh Connerly, the kid out of Oregon. Spielman cites, of course, his unique athleticism, which he does have. His co-host Ryan Wilson, who we should show some love, not a former GM, but had a really good rapport with Spielman. Great pod to go listen to. I'm still listening even as Spielman has moved on. But Wilson's brought up the fact that Connerly would sometimes line up wide on special teams plays. They'd have, push him out to wide receiver. And he just elite athleticism for a tackle who Spielman viewed as a day 2 prospect. Texas offensive tackle Cam Williams. He felt Williams did struggle a little bit against Georgia. But I don't think struggling against Georgia knocks you down anybody's draft board because you're at that point playing a borderline NFL team. You're probably going to have your roughest days against them, but he still views Williams as a top 50 pick. Josh Simmons, the tackle out of OSU. So, and this isn't Josh Simmons' fault, and I think Spielman did acknowledge that, but he said you can't discount the fact that Simmons played a lot early on against some weak competition and played really well. And then played Oregon. Oregon's front, they have so much talent up there. But he said he thought he was struggling against Oregon, and then it was in that game when he got injured and missed the rest of the year. So, lack of final year film against elite competition isn't ideal, but he wasn't saying Simmons isn't going to be a good player or a high pick. He just said he didn't like that he didn't get to see him dominate against top level competition. Clemson tackle Blake Miller, who I've Obviously missed this because I like Miller. I'm not saying he's a round one pick, but I didn't notice about him, what both he and Ryan Wilson were referring to. Too often plays over aggressive, out of control, will sometimes miss blocks because of it. However, played primarily right tackle, but did play left tackle against Pitt, which Spielman said he was able to watch that game. He thought Miller looked better than he expected. He had a solid day as a left tackle, which could help his value. And Spielman, he said, when he gets his hands on you, he wins. Because he said his exact words were, "This is a guy you bring to a bar fight with you. Like if he gets his hands on you, he's gonna beat you. But he needs a coach who settles him down and says, chill out. You have the right mentality, you have the willingness to get after it, but almost too much to the point where you're getting sloppy and missing assignments." So Miller, some upside there, definitely not a day one pick, but a guy that you do want to bring on board. And again, if you feel you have an offensive line coach who can work with him, you develop him. He says right now he kind of projects him as a backup swing tackle. Love Cam Skattebo. Listen, Cam Skattebo is, I get the obsession with him, but when that's one of the comments that Spielman makes here, is that every play is a car crash, which is fun. It's entertaining for fans, right? Look at this guy who's slamming into everybody at 100 miles an hour and doesn't go down. Great. But at the same time, I'm like, how long is your career going to be with that playing style? So what Spielman says about him, couldn't stop watching this guy. Every play is a car crash. He's as physical as they come. Great contact balance. Likely day 3 pick. He's not going to have explosive speed. He's playing running back, where a lot of those guys, if you're not elite, if you're not Gianti, you're not going in the first round. Some notes on another show. Again, Cam Shador had Drew Aller as his QB3 at one point. And again, once Aller fell off, he was no longer there. I can't recall exactly what happened in this episode. They only went 3 deep on the QBs. So here's a note that should be interesting to Jets fans. And there's more on this later. But if you're wondering what the heck the Jets are going to do in the future at quarterback, or is there going to be a short-term solution, some people have mentioned Kirk Cousins, who Spielman did sign. And he was asked about Cousins and how he was playing during the show or during the season on one of their shows. And he said, look, right now Kirk Cousins looks like a shell of his former self. Like he's not the same guy. And if he doesn't improve, the Vikings need to consider benching him, which we know did eventually happen. Now, this episode I liked. Some of my favorite episodes were when they did mocks, because you got an idea of like, okay, these are guys Spielman sees as first-round picks. Because some of these guys, I can tell you right now, aren't universal first-round picks, but in Spielman's eyes, they were. Didn't go into great detail on these guys, so there won't be a ton of notes, but these are just first-rounders who we really liked. This was early, mid-December. So they had 3 people. They were going, round robin. They were sort of, he had every third pick. So he picked for the Jaguars. He took Mason Graham, calling him the most dominant interior lineman in the class. No surprise there. I said a few weeks ago with Dom C that I would take him at 7. I no longer feel that way, not because he's not a great player, but because this DT class is so deep. I'm like, use that 7th pick on a guy that you're not going to be able to find anything close to it later on. Teteroa McMillan. He took Will Campbell for the Browns. No surprise there. He's widely viewed as a 1. Malachi Starks for the Bengals. Tyler Warren to the Colts, and said, I'm listing his position as football player, not tight end. People, is he going to play here? Is he going to play there? He says, Tyler Warren to him, I don't care what you list him as. I'm picking him, and I'm listing him as football player. Tyler Booker, he took, calling him a plug-and-play day 1 starter. Now, this was an interesting one to me. JT Tuimoloau took him in the first round for the Packers. Now, I mentioned earlier, having done a mock with Dom C a couple months ago, or whenever it was, I took Tuimoloau in the first round as well. I don't know if it was the Packers, but it was the bottom of first round. And I don't see him in a lot of first-round mocks. And I watch him at Ohio State, and I've said before, I feel like he's a guy that is in such a loaded defense that it's not like he's playing at a program where he's the only player they've got, and they're going to gear the defense toward his success. I think he does a lot of things at Ohio State that Ohio State can win with him doing those things because they're so good. But I think if you put him in a system where you make him a focal point of your defense and let him rush the passer a lot more, things like that, I think he's worthy of a first-round pick. Another guy he took in the first round, honestly, I wouldn't be a huge fan of this because it was for the Buffalo Bills. He took Princely Umanmielen out of Florida, Ole Miss, formerly Florida. I started watching him as a freshman, as a Gator. I thought he could be a first-round talent. It looks like he may go in round 2 based on a lot of projections, but Spielman has him in round 1 as a Buffalo Bill. And then he took his last first-round pick. I forget which team it was. He took Derek Harmon, the DT, out of Oregon. So those are some of your guys. Like I said, not a lot of surprises there, but I would say the bottom 3, Tuimoloau, Umanmielen, Harmon. I think I've seen him in a few first-round mocks, but I don't know that he's a consensus lock to be a first-rounder. Spielman thought he was worthy of it there back in mid-December, early December. Early January, again, we talk about so this is where the Cam Ward thing gets interesting. Again, Cam Ward stan. I think that's obvious by now. Me, not Spielman. Having said a couple of weeks earlier that Cam Ward was a guy that, look at it, he's chasing a guy down from 50 yards away. That shows a lot of football character, shows how much he loves the game. You got to love it. Early January, Cam Ward plays in a bowl game, plays the first half, and then sits down and takes the rest of the day off while his team loses a lead, falls behind, loses a football game. And that's another thing about Rick Spielman. Old school guy, play football. He says, again, as a listener to the show, I heard him say a million times, he hates that guys sit out bowl games. He's like, compete, be a competitor, put on the pads, play football. And he says here, just now getting my head around it. I'm just now getting to the point where, fine, I can live with the fact that guys don't play in their bowl games. Cam Ward, however, with what he did, Spielman says he hated it. Hated that he quit on the team, left the game early, and he said, quote, be with your team or don't. He didn't think he said it was unacceptable for Ward to leave the game early, but he's like, maybe there's something I'm unaware of. Perhaps there was an agreement, perhaps there was an injury, something. So he's not leaving no room for an explanation. And he did say that he was looking forward, not knowing he'd be working for the Jets at that point. He did say he was looking forward to speaking with Cam Ward at the Combine to ask him what happened. Why'd you leave the game? Was there a good reason? Or did you just decide I was going to go out there, set a record, and then sit? It wouldn't go over well. Listen, I'm not sitting here saying that if he fell to 7, which he won't. I'm not saying Spielman's going to say don't draft him, but or that Spielman won't advise to draft him. But it didn't go over well. Asked about Quinn Ewers, who eventually did come out. Obviously, he's going to be in this class. He thought at this point, early January, that Ewers should go back to school because, of course, at this point, if you think back, there were rumors, like heavy rumors, that Quinn Ewers was being offered $6 million from another college, NIL, to transfer. And Spielman's opinion was, if someone else is going to pay you $6 million, that's more than you're going to make as a second-round pick, and that's where you're going to be. You're not a round 1 guy. And going back to school, look at what just happened with Cam Ward. You might boost your stock and be a first-round pick next year. So you can go back, prove you can stay healthy, bet on yourself, possibly be a first-round pick. So you're going to improve as a player and end up with a lot more money in your bank account. Ewers, as we know, would eventually decide to come out. This is a random note on philosophy that came up while they were talking about picks and signing guys to extension, signing long-term contracts and incentives. He said as the GM, he would always tie team success to the incentives. It would never be you get X amount if you get this number of sacks. No, it had to be you'll get your $500,000 bonus if you get 10 sacks and we make the playoffs. It's not going to be we won 2 games and you're getting a bunch of money because you played well as an individual. I'm sure a lot of players don't like that. It may make some negotiations tougher, but Spielman philosophically said he doesn't believe in giving bonuses to guys for performing well while the team is losing. Jalen Milroe, again, not a first-round pick. He said he had just that was around the time he watched the Michigan game, and he said I watched Milroe again, and the inaccuracy shows up again, and it does every time you watch him. At some point, he'll make eye-popping throws, and it's not Spielman. I mean, Spielman's not saying he won't be a good player. He's just saying that's the biggest hole in his game. And he said this is a bad year to need a quarterback. This is around the time the college football playoffs were going on. So he said Will Howard, who we've not mentioned yet. Ohio State quarterback Will Howard had taken his game to another level during the college football playoffs. And I believe that was the point at which he said he was kind of catching Jaxson Dart, that he liked Dart more, but Howard was creeping up on him. And he liked the way Howard bounced back after the rough loss to Michigan. Talked about Oregon edge rusher Jordan Burch. That Oregon front is so good. Liked his twitch, size, good inside power, plays with good leverage, and he feels like Burch is at the top of the tier 2 edge rushers. So you got the top group, and then Burch is sort of one of the top guys in the next group. Jamari Caldwell, a guy I haven't mentioned yet. His name came up later with Spielman. Spielman hadn't seen a ton of him, but I've been watching a lot of that guy lately. And I think because of Harmon, you don't hear enough about Caldwell, but that dude can play. Again, because of his position, he won't be a first rounder, but I would love that guy playing next to Quinnen Williams. Moving on from that, he touched on Riley Leonard, said Riley Leonard's too inconsistent as well. I've talked about Riley Leonard, and maybe he's not a quarterback, but we'll see. We'll see what happens with him. Following show, again, they talk about Ewers. Said he likes Ewers' resiliency, he likes his toughness, but again, touches on the fact that he doesn't throw the ball down the field as much as he likes, as much as he would like to see. And again, I think I said Dart. It was Ewers. He said Will Howard was gaining on Quinn Ewers, who he liked. And his rankings for that particular week, he gave his top 6. And Rick Spielman's top 6 quarterbacks as of mid-January, January 14th, were Cam, Shador, Jalen Milroe, Jaxson Dart was 4, Quinn Ewers 5, Will Howard 6. Didn't share much, as you would expect. Didn't say nothing specific about the interviews with the Jets. Sitting in on the GM and coach interviews. One of the few sort of peeks behind the curtain, and this isn't Jet specific, this is NFL specific. He's obviously aware of the importance of having a mobile quarterback, but he was surprised at how many candidates placed a ton of emphasis on it. Like, it wasn't just something like, yeah, we know it's important, but he said he was really surprised the number of candidates who had it so high on their board, and which we now know that Aaron Glenn as well is another one who placed a high priority on mobile quarterbacks. And he said a lot of the candidates were talking about that during their interviews with the Jets. Now keep this in mind with player comps. Sometimes you see first round picks and the player comp is a guy that is just not, you're like, how are you telling me this guy's a first round pick and you're comparing him to a journeyman? That's his comp. Sometimes you're talking about, where a guy is versus where he could be, the projection portion of it. But I just thought this was interesting since they're in the same, or would be in the same locker room if the Jets were to get him. Of course, it would require a trade up. But Cam Ward, he said, is a better version of Tyrod Taylor, which you can say, oh my God, Tyrod's a backup quarterback. Who cares? When Tyrod Taylor was a starter, he wasn't a bad player. He doesn't have a ton of starting experience, but when he had it, didn't turn the ball over, good with his legs, made plays with his legs, put points on the board. If you get a better version of that, and we're just talking about play, we're not talking about size, durability, where you would expect Ward to be better than Taylor there. Basically, if you made the starting version of Tyrod Taylor a better, more durable player, you'd have a pretty good quarterback. And that's not to say what Ward can develop into. But I just thought that it was interesting that was his comp, was a guy who's already on the roster. Says even though he has Cam Ward over Shador Sanders, he thinks Shador is a better natural passer. But he will, and you know this if you watch Shador, he will at times hold on to the football for too long. I mean, it's not like Colorado didn't have some receivers. Colorado had some really good receivers. I know the O-line wasn't great, but there were times the blocking was there, and Shador held on to the ball for quite a while. Milroe, again, he says again, Jalen Milroe, he worries about his processing in the pocket. This goes back to what he said earlier about make sure you're building your offense around him, because he's not a guy who's going to be able to do other things you might ask him to do. Jaxson Dart, again, mentions a strong arm, but he says and this is, if you've listened to our show on JetNation Radio for any length of time, when we talk about prospects, one of the biggest things I talk about is tight window throws. When guys aren't making those, it's a red flag. It's not necessarily their fault, but when you play at a super talented program where the windows are just 5 times bigger than you're going to see in an NFL game, it doesn't tell you as much as you'd like to know. And he says that about Jaxson Dart. He says he likes the arm strength, but he worries about the lack of seeing tight window throws. Currently, at that point, this is January 14th. he's got Jaxson Dart as a round 3 pick. That's as of January. Will Howard, big physical, had a chance to interview him, I think, before this pod, and just said he was a really good leader. Let's see. Just want to hop in the chat real quick here because I just saw something pop up, and I don't know that it's relevant because the Jets are the Jets. Tony, the GM, said a little while ago, why waste a pick when the 26th class has much better prospects? That remains to be seen. Maybe they won't, Tony. And then TCCAA says Arch Manning won't be coming out in the 26th draft. Whether Manning comes out or not, I don't see that family letting him come to the Jets. Peyton told them no. Eli told the Chargers no. That family, they make decisions based on what's best for the future of the quarterback. And you're going to have a hard time convincing me that the Jets are going to have a structure in place that makes the Mannings think, wow, this is where we want Arch to be developed. These are the coaches we want working with him. So whether he comes out next year, which I don't think he will, but even when he does, if the Jets are in position to pick first and Arch is coming out, something's going to get. He's not going to be a Jet. Just my opinion. Spielman, talking about Kyle McCord, who made some noise up in Syracuse this year, said he thought he played with a lot more confidence this year. He's making better decisions. Pick game was a head scratcher. I haven't watched that game myself yet. He did throw 5 picks in that game, so he felt like that was obviously, or I guess he was kind of saying a head scratcher was an aberration because he played well for the most part during the year. But he did feel that he dramatically improved his draft stock this year. Prior to this season, Spielman viewed McCord as a guy who was an undrafted free agent type of guy, but he thinks the improved confidence and assertiveness has helped his stock, and now he thinks he'll be a pick. He doesn't specify what range he has him in, but I know some people have suggested him as a day 3 pick for the Jets. I think he lacks the mobility, to be appealing, but we shall see. One question that was asked, I talked about this the other day, and this was they went to their mailbag, right? Fans, listeners send in their questions, and Spielman really liked this question. He said that is a great question, and the question was, can Shedeur Sanders perform without his father as a head coach? I think it's a fair question. Shedeur has spent several years now with his dad as the head coach, and you can have a different rapport, different relationship with your coach than you would with your dad. And I get there's that line, and I think they did a good job of balancing that, but they're still at the end of the day, that's still your father. You've seen the clips of like, hey, put my arm around you, walk up and down the sideline, talk you down, get you up, whatever it may be. Is another coach going to have that relationship? I'm not saying same with Spielman. We don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. But I think that's a good question that hadn't been asked because not many guys come up in that situation. Another noteworthy thing for Jets fans here from Spielman. He doesn't do a lot of hot takes, but every now and then he'll say, I got a bold prediction. Or I got something I'm going to throw out there. And why is this important to the Jets? Because it's a need, and it's where the Jets are picking, and Spielman's in that front office advising. So asked about or offering to throw out a hot take, he says Tyler Warren, Penn State tight end, is a top 10 pick. He said I think he'll go higher than Brock Bowers. Didn't say he was better than Bowers because A, he's not, and B, Warren isn't going to have 5 quarterbacks going ahead of him the way Bowers did. But look, and I love Bowers, but Warren, I'd take him. Absolutely. I would have no issue with that pick at all. As I said, and Spielman mentioned him earlier, he said, look, he's a football player. That's his position, is football player. That was that wrapped up that week's show. And then some notes. This one I liked. They covered some prospects from both Alabama and Ohio State. Went in depth on these. This would be nice if every show was as in depth with all these guys as this one was, but they are not. They don't have the time for that. But again, Quinn Ewers was the first quarterback to get mentioned, and again, he mentioned his pocket awareness, his ability to perform under pressure and concerns about durability. We've heard that. Now, this is an interesting one with Jaxson Dart because I've seen this tweeted out a lot over the past few days, this conversation. But there was more after this, so I was surprised a lot of places settled on this. This is when Spielman said Jaxson Dart, based on speaking to people around the league, was climbing draft boards, and people were impressed with his toughness. As Spielman said, his intangibles are going to be off the charts, on par with those of J.J. McCarthy, and we know how much people raved about him last year. So Dart's intangibles are going to be off the charts. They're impressed with his toughness. He's climbing boards, and there will be more on Dart to come. Then they get into the prospects. So Alabama linebacker Jihad Campbell, obviously a very versatile player, and which Spielman touches on. He says multi-position, lean player, wiry and athletic. Expects him to have a really good pre-draft process. Got better from last year to this year at using his hands to get off blockers, and he's very good in coverage. Then they went on to Alabama edge rusher. They went from Campbell to Quandarius Robinson. So he has to wait. He says with Robinson, he thinks he's going to get underdrafted because he's a better player than people realize. He thinks that being at Alabama meant that he had to wait, as you often do, because Alabama stocked, right? So he says about Robinson, had to wait his turn, high character kid who might be a first-round pick if he transferred. Kind of said like with Mike Green. If this kid transferred and played at a different school where he didn't have to wait to play, he might be a first-round pick. Obviously doesn't feel he will go because he didn't get to play enough. It says right now he's a designated pass rusher, but if he gets stronger against the run, and will be underdrafted, but needs to get stronger against the run. Good football player who knows how to use leverage that not enough people are talking about. Malachi Moore, the Alabama safety, was up next. High character player. Might be the smartest guy on the defensive side of the ball. He is all about football, doesn't want to mess around. Teams are going to want to see his 40 time, but he can play multiple positions and give you a lot of versatility. A poor man's Brian Branch. Was not saying he's Brian Branch, but that's sort of his makeup. That's who it reminded him of. Then we go to Ohio State running back TreVeyon Henderson. Explosive playmaker, speed in the open field, can take it to the house anytime. Ryan Wilson chimes in with a good nugget here to kind of give you an idea how fast Henderson was. Ran a 10.900 meter in high school, which is absolutely blazing. Spielman says he likes it. He can catch it and run it well. He's going to be climbing up draft board. Expects him to run in the 4.3s, which wouldn't be a surprise if he's running that type of time in high school. Then they get to Cody Simon. Cody Simon was an interesting one. I enjoyed this eval. Basically said, coming out of last year, Spielman viewed Simon as an undrafted free agent. But this is the part I liked, where you get the little bit of how much he really thought of the guy. So Spielman had a chance to talk to Simon last year. Thought he was a UDFA type and wouldn't make it in the league. Liked him so much though, the maturity, the character, the intelligence. Thinking he wasn't going to make it in the league, told him after the interview, "Hey man, when you're done with this football, give me a call and I'll see what I can do for you." He said, "I want this guy in my front office." That's what I thought of him. However, went out and had a great year and climbed. He feels like the range, the instincts, have made him a mid-round player. From a player he thought would be a UDFA special teamer type for a couple of years to a player he now thinks will be a 3rd or 4th round pick. And again, spoke very highly of him as a guy who was like, "Hey, I want to hire you when you're done with football." Lathan Ransom, the safety from Ohio State, says he plays with an edge, hard-hitting, come-downhill player. And I apologize. I said it was Moore who was the all-business guy. Not to say Moore isn't, but it was Lathan Ransom who he said when he spoke to him, he was all business. He's all about football. Big-time hitter, better football player than an athlete, and reminded people, don't always judge the football player, not the athlete, because you're drafting a football player. He said he's not very athletic. He's not going to run very fast, but he's a very good football player. That was Lathan Ransom. Armand Membaugh. Now they got all those prospects, the Alabama, Ohio State guys, and they moved on to some more guys. Armand Membaugh out of Mizzou, who I started a thread on him on JetNation in the draft forums a few weeks back. Loved this game. I watched him and thought top 50 player. I watched more of him and I thought 1st round player. Rick Spielman disagrees, and not because he can't play, but he says he's too short. Because Ryan Wilson, again, the co-host, said, "I absolutely love Membaugh. I think he can be a top 12 pick." And Spielman said, "No way. Too short, 6'3", dumpy body, movement side to guard. Will he be a really good player?" So he thinks he's a good player. He said he needs to improve some technical issues, but that if he's going to play in the league, he's going to have to move inside to guard where he'll be very good. He's not going to play tackle at 6'3". It just rarely happens. So we'll see what happens there. Like I said, I love Membaugh. I think he's a really good player. Bowling Green tight end Harold Fannin. Now, on this particular day, So on this particular day, Spielman really said, "I've only watched one game, and it was as often happens. He was watching another team, another player, and Fannin popped during that game and jumped out at him, but he wasn't as focused. So on that day, Spielman said, I don't have a lot to say about Fannin. I haven't watched enough of him, but more on him later. Then we get to Senior Bowl evals. Now, this is good because it's obviously the more recent stuff, and it's the Senior Bowl. You're getting to watch these guys in person against top competition with NFL coaches. You're getting to see day-to-day improvement, hopefully improvement. And so this was the stuff I was looking most forward to when they do their evals. And here's what they came away with from Senior Bowl. And this is where Jaxson Dart really starts to climb in Rick Spielman's mind. First quarterback they touched on was Dylan Gabriel, who fumbled a couple of snaps. Spielman mentions the fact that he's another college quarterback who only took snaps out of shotgun, and you get him to the Senior Bowl, and he's taken snaps from under center, and he's fumbling them. But once they got the team period, and he was taking snaps out of shotgun, he thought that Gabriel made some really good throws. Ball came out really quickly, and he had a better arm, which I said this after, I think, day one of Senior Bowl. I came out and said Gabriel's arm way better than I realized. And maybe I just hadn't watched enough of him, but I remember watching him last year and thinking mid-round pick, doesn't have a great arm. He was zipping it in Mobile, which again, Spielman says here, and he says he thinks he would fit in a system somewhere like with the Dolphins where it's quick snap, get rid of the ball in a hurry, quick reads. He liked him in that type of system. Josh Connerly, who they had touched on earlier, no issues with athleticism. He did get run over at the Senior Bowl. Part of that was because he was out of position, but he said he does need to anchor a little bit better. But he did like in person seeing the nastiness, the aggression with which Connerly played in the run game. Overall, liked him a lot as a prospect. Marshall edge Mike Green, who was one of the stars of Mobile, and now see this I didn't hear. There was a lot of talk about Green getting the edge and getting to the quarterback. And then something that showed up a little bit on film and on the Senior Bowl film that Spielman talks about here. He says when he was trying to show off his power, Mike Green got stonewalled, and he had a really hard time. If he would just stick with what he does well, use that unique length, use that ability to win off the edge, and that athleticism, and he'll be a really good player. So that was who was it? I want to say the NC State tackle, whose name escapes me at the moment, took him on one-on-one and tried to bull rush him and had zero luck. Gray Zabel, who was the star of Senior Bowl week this year, he got a mention from Spielman every day. Basically said he's not quite as thick as Cody Mauch, but a similar type player. Lined up at guard. This was another important one when you're talking about versatility along the O-line. Zabel lined up at guard, played tackle in college, lined up at guard in Mobile, and had as smooth a transition as Spielman has ever seen a player have at the Senior Bowl. Because that happens at the Senior Bowl all the time. That's something I talked about a few weeks ago when everyone says GMs don't need to go because they have film on guys. And my counter to that was, right, but you're often going to have guys who play a position in Mobile that they didn't play, that you didn't go scout them in person or on film because they've not done it before. So that's what happened with Zabel. He moved from tackle to guard, and Spielman thought, smoothest transition he's seen at the position or at any position. Let's see. Tez Johnson, another guy, the wide receiver out of Oregon who got a mention every day from Spielman. He said, look, this guy's like 165. I think he ended up being closer to like 157 or something like that. But reminiscent of Tank Dell and how he was able to cover or how he's able to take on man coverage and separate, how he was able to beat guys deep on go routes. So Tez Johnson got mentions from Spielman on all 3 days. Wyatt Millam, the tackle from West Virginia, felt that he wasn't that smooth after moving inside, did some lunging in the run game. No questions about his toughness, but he thought that Zabel was the better player out of the smaller school. This one was nice to hear because this is one of my guys, right? We always have our guys going into the draft. Ariante Ursary, the tackle out of Minnesota, who I believe is a first-round talent. Spielman disagrees with that. He thinks he's a second-round guy. And I do remember seeing this from a couple of people around Senior Bowl time. Ursary struggled early on during one-on-ones, but eventually settled down and did a really nice job. Good in pass pro. Tough to get around because of his size and his arm length, which is, again, you watch him on film, I think he's a first-round pick, or at least a first-round talent, top 50 pick. Landon Jackson, speed to power guy, another an Arkansas kid who I like. I don't think he's as explosive as some of the other guys in the class, but I think he physically, I think he's got a thick lower half. He can hold up well. He's has the ability to be a little bit better a better all around player. Good against the pass and the run. But Spielman says he lacks fluidity. He's going to have to rely on his power and his counter moves. Willie Lampkin, I want to see Willie Lampkin succeed. Everybody wants to see Willie Lampkin succeed, and Spielman praised him. The things, everything you hear about Lampkin, the grit, the toughness, the technique. Spielman just says he finds it really tough seeing a 270-pound lineman lining up against a zero technique. So, a true guy, 330, 340 lineman giving up 60, 70 pounds. But again, loves the way he plays the game. Who doesn't? A guy you can't not root for. Gave Riley Leonard some props, not so much about his play, but he said, look, this guy was on the national championship game not that long ago, and he's down here trying to show what he can do. Jaxson Dart, again, day 2 notes. Quickest released in Mobile. Arm talent, again, says was better than we saw on tape. Looked like the most natural quarterback on the field on day 1. The field, he says, is wide open after the top 2 QBs. But NFL scouts, 1 second. Okay, he talked about how, and I've talked about this in the past, again, a part of evaluating these guys at the Senior Bowl. Spielman mentioned, and he mentioned it last year too, the NFL scouts always ask the coaches who go to the Senior Bowl, and, Jim Nagy, to put the top quarterbacks on the same roster, because they want them coming out side by side. They want a side by side comparison of, this QB1 to QB2 to QB3, like the guys in Mobile, the top 3 quarterbacks. I don't want to watch one guy now and then the other 2 guys in 3 hours when they're practicing with the other team. Like, they want them in a row. So he was out there with Milroe and talks about how they did it last year with Bo Nix and Michael Penix. They were both out there at the same time for that, real-time side-by-side comparison. Jalen Milroe, again, looks mechanical throwing it. Best athlete in the class, but sometimes he looks like he's shot putting when he's throwing the ball. Biggest question is going to be getting through reads and progressions, and he was a little bit hesitant on day 1. Deion Walker, I've talked about this on JetNation Radio with Dylan when I've gone solo as well, because Walker was my favorite defensive guy in this class. There are now questions about was he injured last year, because his tape from last year was nowhere near as good as his freshman and sophomore year at Kentucky. And day 1 of the Senior Bowl, similar thing from Spielman, saying no question about size, a little bit thinner in the calves and ankles than you would like, but he was disappointed in how often he was stood up, which is an observation I made a couple of weeks ago when watching, for the first time this year, watching Walker extensively, because I'd watched so much of him previously. I felt like, well, I know what he is. I don't need to see a lot more. But then you double back and check it. He just kept getting stood up. The pad level was terrible. And I'm like, this looks like a day 3 pick. I thought he was a first round talent. Spielman said he was getting stood up, getting knocked off the ball. Obviously not a good assessment. Showed flashes, but to be the best version of himself, he has to keep his pad level down. Then they closed out day 1 with Ole Miss DT Walter Nolan. Another DT class is so good. Says reminiscent of Kalijah Cansey, the Pitt product who went to Tampa. Quickest first step of all the defenders on day 1. Some said Aeneas Peebles. Peebles, to me, on film looked a little quicker out of his stance. But either way, both should be good players. And he says things will be a good 3-tech as a pro. That was day 1 wrapped up. They moved on to day 2 real quick in the chat. Lauren, wonder if Gabriel was related. Not sure. And is Manning eligible? Next year he should be, but I think they've said his plan is to do all 4 years. Peyton did all 4 years. Eli did all 4 years. Even if he was eligible, I don't think he's coming out. So day 2, some notes. Again, Spielman says he was surprised how often, and this is just some conversations with teams about how they're digging in on players. Surprised how frequently teams are going back to talk to high school coaches. They're going back that far. In some cases, even going back to talk to 7-on-7 coaches, which, the 7-on-7 leagues are growing in popularity. You see a lot of highlight plays out of there. And some NFL teams are contacting these coaches to ask about the players, their character, things like that. So teams, as time goes on, they're digging further and further. LSU tackle Emory Jones, Spielman says, struggled on day one, but looked much better when he was moved inside to guard on day two. Looked absolutely dominant in the run game, moving people around. Jonas Savania out of Arizona, played left tackle in Arizona, but struggled at right tackle and in space in Mobile. They moved him inside to guard, and he looked phenomenal. Feels like his lower body. I'd commented before on the thick lower half with Savania when you watch him. Spielman said maybe the most unique lower body he's seen on a player, and that his best position as a pro will be guard. So those two guys alone, I mean, that gives a pretty big boost to your guard class. You're taking two tackles in Jones and Savania if they do, in fact, if teams want them to play there, projecting better at guard than they do at tackle. So not great news for the tackle for if you're looking for a tackle, unless you think he's wrong and they can play there. Okay, so we talked about, I mentioned earlier, Spielman says again, the importance of going to the Senior Bowl to watch guys play a different position. Says Gray's Abel went on day two, played left guard, right guard, and center. He said he's good enough that he would consider him at the bottom of round one, compared him to Graham Barton, the Duke product from last year. And he says he thinks that he's a day one starter who looked even better. That was a big thing. He said, day one, Zabel comes out, has this amazing day, and you're watching it and thinking, was it a fluke? Was he all fired up and just so ready to go? To small school guy, chance to prove himself. Is there a drop off on day two? Said he was better on day two than he was in day one, which he obviously loved to see. Gets to Deion Walker again. So I'm listening to this, right? Edge of my seat. Please tell me Deion Walker looks better on day two than he does on day one. And he does. He says day two, Deion Walker, although he walked off injured, I believe he came back on. He does show unique athleticism for his size. Lower body's a little bit stiff, but basically played with a lower pad level on day two and showed he can be a really good interior defensive lineman. He'll have to, in his interviews, he'll have to clarify, like, is it coaching? Is it just, do you have a hard time staying low? Is it injuries? What are the problems that you're not able to consistently play with a low pad level? And he said, you want to show these guys on film? Look, this is what you look like when you play high. And this is what you look like when you stay low, like dominant player when you keep the pad level down. Disappointment a little bit in Michigan running back Donovan Edwards. Said he had some fumbles on day two, and he recalls seeing 3 or 4 of them during the season. So the difficulty holding onto the football could be hurting his stock. Oklahoma State linebacker Nick Martin, who I've watched a bit in the pre-draft process. I liked his play in the box, really aggressive downhill guy, getting in the backfield, being disruptive. Spielman notes that he did a really nice job in coverage, staying stride for stride with some of the better runners, some of the backs. So maybe you have a good all-around back there. This is a guy he really loved. Central Arkansas linebacker David Walker. I was able to go back. I tweeted it out earlier. I went back. I had 3-4 highlights of him from what I've watched of him previously, and saying just explosive, disruptive, and reminiscent of Brandon Graham. And we all know what kind of career he had. Jalen Milroe again, not a lot of difference. Just looks awkward taking snaps from under center. Jaxson Dart was the most impressive quarterback again on day two to Rick Spielman. He said at this point, when you have your clusters, right? If you listen to Daniel Jeremiah, you hear him talk about these clusters and cluster busters, and when you have a bunch of guys with similar grades in one spot. And Spielman said, this is it. From now, like from the Senior Bowl to the draft, is your chance to break out and prove yourself. When you have to make things happen to separate yourself from guys when you're in that cluster. And more praise once again for Tez Johnson. Says Tez Johnson cannot be covered. Makes the Tank Dell comparison yet again. If you've watched Tank Dell and the difference he makes in that offense when he's on the field, all this Tez Johnson praise, like he's starting to sound like a guy you want on your team, no? Day 3, final day of the Senior Bowl, and the last episode Spielman would do before his farewell episode announcing his moving on to the Jets. Lauren says, notice you have the book Beyond Broadway Joe. Great book. Yeah, that's a really good one. I read that a couple years ago. And Eskenazi. I'm not sure I've read that one. I've got a couple back there I haven't read yet, and the ones you see have been read. The ones that are stacked up have not. Some good stuff here though from day 3 that I really liked from Spielman. Because look, we all like that confirmation bias, right? So Gray Zabel did a great job. So again, saying he's going to move up draft boards. No surprise there. That was pretty much everybody in Mobile was saying that. And this is where he said, watching these small school, because they talked about how, and if you go to the Senior Bowl, or if you watch and pay attention to it, you see that the big school guys with the big profiles who everyone knows they're going early, they will often practice 2 days, sometimes 1 day, and go home. Like, I let the scouts see in person that what they saw on film is real, and I'm going to leave now because I know I'm going in the top, whatever. So when those guys leave, that's when the small school guys get to slide in. Maybe those guys who weren't getting a lot of reps on day 1 and 2, maybe now they get 20, 30 reps today that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And Spielman said, this is the reason you come down here, to watch these small school guys go head-to-head with the big school guys. He mentions David Walker, who I'd mentioned earlier with the Brandon Graham comp, mentions Tez Johnson again. A lot of this will be repetitive because it's day 3. And he liked a lot of the same guys. Tez Johnson, small, doesn't love his size, but he says you can't be covered, which is, you can be, I don't think anyone cares how big you are if nobody can catch up with you or keep up with you. Jaxson Dart, again, got better every day. Position comes natural, and the more he watched him in person, the better he liked him than what he saw on tape. Mentions again that Bo Nix climbed last year from being a guy no one was talking about as a first rounder all the way up to pick 11. So Dart, he would actually go on to say, if you're a listener to their show, great chemistry with him and Wilson. They have what they call dollar bets. And if they have an idea or an epiphany or what some people might call a hot take that they think the other guy may not agree with or they think might surprise, they'll say, all right, I got a dollar bet for you. And they add up their dollar bets through the year, and at the end of the year, somebody wins. And so Spielman says, I got a dollar bet for you. Jaxson Dart goes in the first round. So Jaxson Dart in January, Spielman saying third rounder. Then you get the buzz Spielman is hearing about Dart from scouts. And then Spielman goes to watch him in person and says, this guy is a better thrower of the football than I realized on film. And he looks natural. And he's the best looking quarterback out here. Now from January to the Senior Bowl, Rick Spielman is saying, this guy's going first round. Now, that conversation of how early in the first round becomes what happens in NFL front offices. But just important to note that a guy who the Jets hired to advise their GM views Jaxson Dart as a guy who should go in the first round. And I've said in the past, when people say, oh, you're reaching, why take that guy at 7? You get him at 20. Okay, well, you're not at 20. And if no one's willing to trade back with you, you're picking at 7. And if you're willing to make him your franchise quarterback at 20, why wouldn't you make him your franchise quarterback at 7? It's not like you got a bunch of other picks. So just some food for thought there. And he may get to the point where the Jets think he's worth 7. They may get to the point where they think he's a third rounder. But I thought it was interesting, again, to get this sort of peek behind the curtain. As I've said in years past, I said this to Dylan Terman the other day. When the Browns drafted Baker Mayfield, I remember getting a tweet from a good friend of mine who said, that morning, are you seeing the smoke screen out of Cleveland where the Browns are saying they might take Mayfield? And I said, they probably will take Darnold. However, it's worth noting that Scott McCloughan, former GM, had been hired by the Browns to work in that front office. And earlier in the year, when he wasn't working for the Browns front office, he was on a podcast in which he said he believed Baker Mayfield was QB1 in that draft. So obviously he did some convincing, or maybe they all agreed with him. Whatever it may be, listen, I'm mentioning 100 guys. The Jets aren't drafting 100 guys. But this gives us a little bit of insight into one of the prominent voices in that draft room and what he feels about some of these players. So there he was at the Senior Bowl saying Jaxson Dart, dollar bet that he will be a first-round pick. He said again, Milroe struggled with touch and accuracy in intermediate where Dart puts the ball. And this was red zone as well. They said one thing Milroe struggled with, and every time I hear this, I don't know why, I always think back to young John Elway, because I think I was a very young fan, and even as a very young fan who knew, I was probably 12, But I was like, Jesus, why is this guy throwing the ball a million miles an hour to somebody standing 6 feet from him? And he said with Jalen Milroe, they were running a lot of red zone. Milroe was not taking anything off. Milroe, million miles an hour, Dart throwing with touch, putting the ball in a spot where his receiver could get it. So he felt like he impressed in that particular area more so than Milroe. Darius Alexander, who got a ton of love, a ton of press during the Senior Bowl. Shout out to Dom C on that call. Spielman says that Alexander was extremely impressive. Nebraska DT Ty Robinson, a guy I really like, sort of a middle later rounder guy. Strong at the point of attack, holds up against the run. And Spielman says stiff lower body, and he's a guy who's going to have to win with energy and effort. I don't think that'll be a problem for him. He's a high energy, high effort guy. Wide receiver Jack Besh, who of course would go on to win the Senior Bowl MVP, got a shout out from Spielman saying it's not a great wide receiver class, but there are guys like Besh will find a way to make a roster. He's got reliable hands. He's a good route runner. He gets open and catches the ball. So that's why he liked Besh. Now back to Harold Fannin. And again, if you're a listener to the show, you know that Fannin was the first draft prospect I mentioned on JetNation Radio this year. One of my favorite tight end prospects. Thought he'd fly under the radar, but just did too much. He's no longer an under the radar guy. He's probably a top 50 prospect. So Fannin, the tight end out of Bowling Green, who had all the catches in the world this year, Spielman had a few thoughts on him. He said Fannin had 2 or 3 drops on day one, but he said you also consider the fact that a lot of these guys haven't played in months. They're shaking the rust off. Let's see how they look after that. But then says Fannin is a positionless player because he does so many things well. And the thing that worked, the thing that he thought was most impressive was when Fannin was called on to be a lead blocker. Keep in mind, this is a guy who caught like 130 balls in college last year. And Spielman says his most impressive work was as a lead blocker, stuck his face in there. You could hear the pop from up in the press box when he came into contact with the linebackers. You need to figure out what he does best to find a role. And he said he recalls the last year, 3 or 4 teams saying that they had no use for Brock Bowers because he doesn't fit what they do. And Spielman's reaction was, yeah, but he's pretty good. So teams had no need or use for Bowers, but Spielman kind of felt like find a need for him or, find a spot for him. Couple more. Elijah Arroyo, the tight end from Miami, who blew up down in Mobile. Spielman said the things that worry him are the 1-year wonder label, which he said he's been burned. He said, as a GM, I've been burned by enough 1-year wonders. Like you start to remember. So he worries that Arroyo was a 1-year wonder, and there are some durability issues. Nebraska cornerback Tommy Hill. He says look for him to possibly move to safety at some point. Said he had a really tough week, just didn't have the speed to keep up, but he's physical enough as a DB that he could see a team picking him up and asking him to move to safety. And mentions Gray's Abel once again, saying Wyatt Millum, who's a highly touted guy, Wyatt Millum. If you're following the draft, you know Millum was a guy that a lot of people are talking about pre-draft. He says Zabel outperformed Millum all week. So he loved him. Loved him a lot. So there you have it, folks. You don't have to do it now. You don't have to go back and listen to, 20 some hours of podcasts to get the nuggets, the notes, the thoughts on what Spielman was saying about these guys as the year progressed. A little bit of thoughts on his philosophy. As I said, tying performance bonuses to team performance, which I absolutely love. And the ascension of Jaxson Dart from 3rd round guy to I'm hearing he's moving up boards to now I've seen him in person and he's better in person than he is on film to I bet you $1 he's a 1st round pick. So Jaxson Dart, round 1 pick in the eyes of Rick Spielman. Does Darren Mougey agree? Does Aaron Glenn agree? Do they agree but feel 7 is too early? A lot to figure out. Charles says in the chat, we need to draft a real safety. Yeah, they do. Xavier Watts, obviously a guy a lot of people are talking about. I mentioned, Ohio State. You got Ohio State's got a NFL worthy safety. Alabama, you've got I wouldn't say a very deep safety class. And the Jets have to take one. I honestly haven't looked at the free agent class, the safety free agent class. But if you can get a Malachi Moore, I mean, get a guy from a big program, and that's another thing to keep in mind, right? When we're talking about philosophies, if you're looking at Malachi Moore, if you're looking at Ohio State and Lathan Ransom, these are guys. If you go back and see what Aaron Glenn said to his defense when he was talking to them in training camp and saying, pointing out the guys who went to schools that won. What did you do? You woke up every day and you expected to win, right? Every time you stepped on the field, you expected to win. And that's what he wanted to build. And so I would imagine that when the Jets are drafting, you're going to see a lot of guys come from programs with winning records and playoff appearances. Not all of them. Maybe. I mean, they only have a handful of picks, which is another thing worth keeping an eye on. Did the Jets trade down? Spielman, you look at, and we'll talk about this Thursday night, myself and Dylan Terman. You look at Rick Spielman's history of drafting with the Vikings, tons of picks, trades back, add picks. George Payton, his right-hand man in Minnesota, who then went on to Denver, his first couple drafts, drafted 10 guys one year, draft 9 guys another year. Then Sean Payton shows up and probably has some say in what happens on draft day. So tough to say. But you've got Mougey, who learned under Payton, who learned under Spielman, with Spielman in the room, and Spielman being an avid believer in adding picks and drafting a bunch of guys. So we'll see what happens. That's the rundown on all of Spielman's take. Look, I could go further back, but then you're getting to like early college season and maybe a lot of evaluations that could change significantly. I thought it'd be good to go back about 3 months, 4 months, however far it was, get Spielman's takes and share them with you. So now you've heard his thoughts on these players without you having to do the work. Have a good one, Jets fans. We'll see you on Thursday night.